I'm here today with Eric Atcheson, the author of a new book called On Earth as It Is in Heaven, a faith-based toolkit for economic justice. Eric is a pastor in the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and the author of Oregon Trail Theology, the Frontier Millennial Christian's Faith, and How We're Ready. He's now pastor at Valley Christian Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Previously, he served as the interim director of family ministries at First Presbyterian Church in Vancouver, Washington. He holds a doctorate in ministry from Seattle University and used to live in Vancouver, now lives in Birmingham. So he's had a big move recently. Eric, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for extending me the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's an interesting new book. And, when I first heard about it, I said, okay, well, I really need to meet this guy and talk about this more. So I'm really glad we're getting the opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. Besides just the brief bio that I gave, can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
I joke with people that I went into ministry when I learned that becoming a dinosaur hunter wasn't an option. I kind of came of age during the Jurassic Park franchise's heyday. And about that time, I told an auntie of mine at a family reunion, I think I want to be a Bible prophet when I grow up. And that was before I learned about the hair shirt dress code and the fact that you weren't pink slipped in that line of work. The Kings just executed you. But a funny thing happened over the course of my childhood where I began to feel like someone as progressive as me, God would never call to be a pastor. Growing up in Kansas, I felt very much like my faith was a sort of aberration around my peers and their parents and their families. And it wasn't until I was sort of preparing to go off to college. And my dad, who I affectionately refer to as a CEO, a Christmas and Easter only churchgoer, kind of sat me down and he said, look, like I've seen you preach. I've seen the way you talk about your faith. You need to at least consider this for a career. Even though it's not my faith, I know it's yours. And that sort of really broke the ice for me. And I really haven't looked back since. It's one of those things that sort of you want so badly that you forget how to want a whole lot of other things. And so I've been in parish ministry now for a decade or so. I was ordained 10 years ago next month. And with no end in sight. I'm here in Birmingham now with my wife and daughter, and we love it here very much, and are really enjoying getting to know the area, especially the outdoor areas, since a lot of the indoor areas aren't quite ready yet due to COVID. So we've had to acclimatize a little differently to a new city, but we like it very much here.
Very cool. Well, we are living in interesting times, no question about that. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned that you wrote a previous book that's got another really interesting title. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I mentioned, I grew up in the age of Jurassic Park. I also grew up in the age of the Oregon Trail video game, which you can still play. If you go online to websites like classicreload.com, and I promise that's not a plug. What they do is they use something that's called an emulator, which is exactly what it sounds. It emulates the games of yesteryear so that people who have a real hankering for nostalgia can go and play the games of their childhood. And in Oregon Trail, for anyone who's not familiar, the premise is you're leading a family from what was my hometown in Kansas City to what would become my hometown as an adult in the Willamette Valley in the Pacific Northwest. And in order to do that, you had to make a lot of different decisions about the amount of provisions you would buy, the oxen that would take your wagon, how you would cross rivers, when to stop and hunt for food. And that game was sort of so addictive to us that many years later as adults, I think it was Anna Garvey wrote in an article, she coined those of us who grew up with this game the Oregon Trail generation, because we don't quite fit neatly into the entire sort of millennial generation, where maybe older millennials, maybe slightly, the youngest of Gen X. but we grew up with this sort of being the paradigm for how we learned to kind of make decisions. And I took kind of each element of that game of sort of preparing to go out into the trail, of choosing how you're going to cross rivers, of when to hunt for food. And I took each element of that game kind of as a template for here are how millennials, this sort of almost obscene, the obscenely frequently talked about generation, relates to the church in the United States and relates to faith. And that, we shouldn't be considered a lost cause by the church, but that reaching us is going to require a sort of a fundamentally different paradigm than reaching our parents or our grandparents, because we've really come of age during some events that really shook the public's trust in the church. The sort of the televangelist and financial and marital improprieties of the 90s, the early aughts, the Boston Globe uncovering the extent of the Catholic abusive priest crisis. Like, all of those had a cumulative effect on us, but that doesn't mean you should just write us off. That there is still this this new path, this trail that we've charted for ourselves, and there is a way for the church to speak to that, and that just sort of came about because it was something I couldn't fit into a sermon series. I couldn't fit into an article or a blog post. The only way to say what I needed to say was through a book. And that was sort of the gateway to writing a second one, which ended up being On Earth as It Is in Heaven.
That's really wild. Very interesting how these things come about. And I have to say that I do remember playing Oregon Trail on my Atari back in the day.
Yes. Yeah. And you can tell that my publisher sort of really leaned in hard on that nostalgia factor with the cover. Because if you Google it, you look on Amazon or something, it's that old Atari.
Is it really? Oh my
cover, pixelated cover. And it was so cool that when I went back to publish On Earth as It Is in Heaven, I asked my publisher during negotiations, I want that same cover designer to do my next book too. Like, I thought, because it was so cool. Yeah, it was uncanny, sort of how well sort of that sort of nostalgic look, they just nailed it.
So what led you to write the second book?
So you mentioned I did my doctoral work at Seattle University. Part of the doctorate, of course, is writing a sort of a thesis or a project that sort of practically relates to ministry. And about the time I was starting that program, I was serving as the minister of the Disciples Congregation in Longview, Washington, which is just up the freeway from Vancouver. And it's an old lumber town. So very blue collar, heavily unionized. And right at about the same time, something that I don't think ever happened before, the workforces of two of the three largest employers in town, one of the lumber mills, and then one of the school districts, the teachers. So the millwrights and the teachers both went on strike, one right after the other. So like the biggest employer in town and then like the third biggest employer in town had their entire workforces out on strike, pretty much within just a few weeks of each other. And as you can imagine, in a smaller town, that really sort of sent shockwaves through a lot of the community. And I had congregants directly impacted by that. Congregants who were on the picket lines, congregants who weren't, but who wouldn't cross the picket lines, trying to live on strike pay and trying to sort of get their due in order to take care of their families. The millwrights at that point had been without a contract for over a year and a half before going on strike. And the teachers, this was actually part of like a statewide wave of strikes because the state legislature at the time refused to adequately fund schools. So they'd sort of so abdicated that duty that the state Supreme Court was fining the legislature every day for not passing a constitutional budget.
Wow.
And so the teachers were like, this is the only card we have left to play. And what I remember was, writing letters to the editor. I spoke at one of the rallies for the millwrights down in Portland. And I thought to myself, was this what the support that the workers really needed or wanted from their churches? Like, I knew what my congregants felt was important, but what about other workers who were religious, who were of faith? What did they need from their pastors? What did they need from their churches? And so I just decided to go ask them. And that became the thesis, was what do workers need from their churches, and what do pastors feel like they can contribute when something like that happens in their community? And I took all that data and basically realized that what everyone, sort of clergy and lay alike, wanted was a way to talk about this from a spiritual perspective in church. Not in a way that sort of the church is trying to be heavy-handed or ham-fisted, but in a way to talk about things of matters of financial security, of economic security, of being able to have a roof over your head and food on your table, in a way that sort of went deeper than sort of it's the right thing to do. Okay, but what does the Bible really say about that? What does our faith tradition and our history really say about those topics? And that was the genesis for On Earth as It Is in Heaven. It was always meant to be that resource so that churches could facilitate those conversations.
Wow. I love any time that, faith gets applied to real life as opposed to being some abstract theology. And so I'm really glad that you took that tact. Given that it was a thesis and then became a book, and was initially really targeted toward that kind of specific need, who do you think the book most appeals to now?
I kind of wrote it with a couple of audiences in mind. One obviously was sort of my colleagues. Like, are you trying to figure out how to address the economic insecurities for people in your pews? Here's a way to talk with them about it. But I also kind of wrote it for lay people who, whether or not they're involved in organized labor, and I think increasingly fewer people are, to say like, hey, this text or collection of texts that we take as sacred, that we believe is the Word of God, here are some of the things it says about money, about economics, that we maybe haven't considered, or we haven't considered in their totality. And so it's always sort of meant to be a springboard. It's not an exhaustive look at sort of the intersection of faith, values, and economics. What it was sort of always meant to do was to offer you like, this passage or that passage or this story from church history, and to get you thinking, to get you going, to learn more, to sort of poke and prod the church into greater self-discovery. So, while, I wrote it as obviously as a pastor thinking of other pastors, I really tried to do my best, and my editor held me to this, to minimize sort of the churchy jargon, to make it accessible to sort of anyone who has that interest of faith and economics.
So I can imagine that you're probably lifting up a number of different passages from the Bible that maybe have either been ignored or maybe even misinterpreted, or historically. How's that played out?
I can give a couple of really quick examples. One is the story of Joseph, and not his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, but his monopoly on the grain supply in Egypt after 7 years of famine. And the people of Egypt come to him and say, we're desperate, make us your slaves, because then you are obligated to feed us. And that was not something I was ever taught in Sunday school, nor really was I actually even taught it in seminary. I really began wrestling with that passage only after I was already a pastor and heard it discussed in another by someone else in sort of a community discussion. And I think there are sort of dimensions to, say, the Joseph saga that really appeal to us, because Joseph as an individual is so compelling that he really fits our conception of faith as an individual personal relationship between ourselves and our Creator, which it is, but that's sort of like saying that only squares can be rectangles. Like, once you branch out beyond squares, you realize there are all sorts of rectangles. So once you branch out beyond just my personal individual connection to God, or Brian's personal individual connection to God, you begin to see there is so much to the Bible, and so much to the stories of people like Joseph, or like Solomon, the son of David. Again, an incredibly compelling individual. God appears to him in his dreams, offers him wisdom of sort of a divinely unique wisdom, which ultimately Solomon then kind of goes and squanders. It's a really sort of sad end to such a remarkable person. But what we skip over is Solomon's sort of institution of state-sponsored slavery, of compelled forced labor of the workers in Israel, and what would become Israel and Judah. And the reason he's able to do that is because more and more workers over the course of the century sort of have been separated from their familial lands, the lands that were handed down to them generation by generation through their tribes. And there were prescriptions in Levitical law trying to prevent that. Most notably the Jubilee year, every 7th or every 49th or 50th year, all land returning to their original families. That never really came into effect. And so Solomon was left with this labor force disconnected from their own lands, and basically put them to work as slaves to undertake his building projects. And the chief of his forced labor was Jeroboam, who incited the insurrection that led to the separation of Israel and Judah. And that is a detail, I think, that we sort of, again, kind of very easily skip over, when in fact there really is this collective dimension of faith involved in Solomon's story. It wasn't all dreams and adjudicating the parenthood of infants. He had an impact on his entire nation in a way that no king before him had.
So what are some of the things that you uncovered that you think are the most relevant for the church today, in terms of, serving for the good of our flock?
Yeah. Like I said, I think a lot of it comes down to what I said, that the emphasis on the personal relationship, the sort of the bilateral relationship between myself and God, which sort of takes out of the relationship out of the context of everyone else's relationships with God and our relationships with each other. And when we acknowledge that we've kind of done that we've sort of taken our connections to God out of context, and we ask ourselves, why have we done that? Why have we sort of taken something so important, so vital to our spirituality? Well, it's because once you kind of compartmentalize your faith down solely to the individual level, it almost offers a pass on sort of all the collective level aspects that faith, that the Bible would ordinarily address. And so it becomes very easy to say, well, we aren't supposed to speak as faith leaders to something like labor organizing. We aren't supposed to speak to things like a better living standards, a higher minimum wage, or frankly, during the civil rights movement, to integration. And this is something that kind of goes back decades. I spent a section in one of the chapters talking about how there were, some of the richest industrial tycoons of the day were bankrolling very famous preachers like Dwight Moody, because Moody's emphasis on that individual relationship fit the agenda of those tycoons, because they did not want their workers to understand themselves as a collective, as a group, but rather just as, a sum of individuals. And I think once we acknowledge, okay, we've done that, well, that's the first step to then addressing it, is to say, okay, we've done this. How do we kind of swing the pendulum sort of back towards a healthy medium, right? Like, I don't feel like, I've never felt like an extremist in writing anything that I've written. It's me sort of recognizing that we live in a state of extremis, and asking, how do we swing the pendulum back to something that's fair and that's just? Because I think right now that's sort of, we're living in a state that's sort of really out of balance.
Well, you're certainly raising some very important issues that, deserve a great degree of change, I think, from where Christianity's been. And I would also wonder what your thoughts are relative to the quote unquote Christian nationalism that we've seen lately, and kind of intertwining of Christianity and politics in our country.
Yeah. This is something that that I actually was really wrestling with as far back as Oregon Trail theology, because this was sort of the result of a heart-to-heart really with my editor, who kind of, really emphasized to me, like, a lot of the nationalism, the Christian nationalism that's coming up is in fact coming up from members of that Oregon Trail generation, the older millennials and younger Gen X's. Josh Hawley is a member of the Oregon Trail generation, so there is a lot of soul searching that, regardless of our age, we need to be doing. This isn't something that, sort of phases out with time. The thing about nationalism is it's amorphous. It's ephemeral. It's almost it's like liquid. It can fit anywhere, and it will. It evolves over time because it has no heart. It has no soul. It relies on finding ways to keep itself going, whatever that takes. And so when you look at something like Christian nationalism, which really interlinks with white nationalism, whiteness has never been objectively defined, because you can't objectively define it. And so for me, as someone who, I'm of Armenian descent, there was a point in time Armenians were not considered white, where when we began immigrating as genocide refugees, housing covenants began to ban Armenians. And the Immigration Act of 1924 functionally banned Armenians from immigrating to the United States for almost 40 years. But over time, whiteness expanded to, in some cases, include us, because it was in whiteness's interest to do that. Now consider that with nationalism. How has sort of nationalistic identity expanded and contracted to serve its own self-interest? You think of someone like Ted Cruz, who is, who is an immigrant, born to immigrants. You would think that sort of a ideologically consistent nationalism would reject such a spokesperson. But if it's in nationalism's interest to have someone with the podium of Ted Cruz, the platform of Ted Cruz, sharing its talking points, then nationalism finds a way to include him. And so that's what we're seeing.
Strict pragmatism.
Yes. Like it's fun for being an ideology. It can be very pragmatic about when it comes to its own survival. Yeah. And so, and that's why I think you're seeing it come out in my generation, because that's key to its survival. is for the younger people in younger generations to pick it up, even if it doesn't look quite like the nationalism or white supremacy of yesteryear. It look, yeah, like, that there is, it will allow itself those evolutions in order to ensure its survival.
So next, if you could talk about a couple of different things, maybe one is, what do you see next for you in terms of the evolution of these thoughts? And maybe more broadly, what do you see as next for our country?
Oh, geez, for myself, that's, I think it's a little tough for me to answer because I'm still, very new to what is for me a new region of the country. And I'm still very much in sort of watching and learning mode. I have a cousin who lives down on the Gulf Coast in the Pensacola area, just a few hours away. And when I first told him that we might be moving to Birmingham, and I asked him about the city because we would be moving here sight unseen. I had never been to Birmingham previously, and asked him about the city. First words out of his mouth were, "Man, the history, like you got to respect the history." And so a lot of what I've been doing has been sitting in on meetings with groups that are focused on anti-racism, that are focused on civil rights, that are purposefully multi-faith or interfaith, and just learning, like listening and learning. And I'm still figuring out my place here and all that. And I think I probably will for some time. I think that there is a role that I can play as someone who benefits from, at least situationally, most of the time from white privilege, that has enough experience as part of an ethnic group that has faced a lot of persecution in the past, that I can function well in those historically white spaces to explain the impact of racial supremacy and ethnic supremacy on my own family and in my own story. And so I'm learning spots where I'm able to do that, and where I can listen, and what do I have to add to the dialogue that's already taking place. I think that's one of the tough things for a lot of pastors when we start somewhere new, is to remember God was already at work long before we arrived, long before we were born. And so I've really tried to be humble and add to it on sort of where I feel like I'm able to. On a national level, I think we may be getting closer to the reckoning, the acknowledgement that we need, that sort of hasn't really ever come around the history of how America was built and upon whom America was built. Again, I feel like there's a role for me, for other ethnic Armenians in the United States to play. Joe Biden, just a week or two ago, became the first president in 40 years to acknowledge the Armenian genocide as exactly that, a genocide. Well, just a few days after that, an online acquaintance of mine, who I think is based out of Colorado, he co-authored a piece in the Washington Post about how, okay, now that this recognition has happened, what's next? How do we build on that? And his case was for, how do we acknowledge the rolling genocide of indigenous tribes in the United States? So I would say that that's nationally how we move forward, is sort of that we continue incrementally building upon each success to say, all right, we've achieved this, it's important, we celebrate. What comes next for humanizing others, for recognizing their stories, for making sure their stories get taught, get heard, and that we're able to have an honest conversation about what amends look like. And I'm not the person, I think, to answer all of those questions. A lot of those are really above my pay grade. But again, what I can do is sort of bring that back to Christian spaces, churches, and other Christian areas in life, and say, here's how we can contribute to that conversation. Here's how we can sort of move forward ourselves and help other folks in their own walks move forward.
Well, as you've alluded to, within the last few months, we've experienced a lot of different things than we did for the previous 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe we're turning a corner, so to speak. Kind of feels that way a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But, a lot of us thought we turned a corner when Barack Obama became president, too. And that obviously went south in a big way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we keep that from happening again? I guess I know it's a really impossible question to answer, but
I don't know. Maybe this is just me. And again, like the life experience of an older millennial, I feel like each new president that has come about, sort of since I can remember. I mean, I was alive when Bush 43 and Clinton began their terms, but obviously I don't really remember much of it. But or Bush 41, excuse me. But for Bush 43 and then Obama and then Trump, I remember the first year of their presidencies, just these really unrealistic questions about what their presidencies meant. Like Obama becoming president, does this mean that we're in a post-racial society or that we've gotten over our racism? Clearly not. And then when Trump comes into office, does this mean he's going to be presidential? Clearly not. And I do think I do see some of it come up now with Biden. Like, is Biden the next FDR? Clearly not, for so many reasons, both good and bad. And so at some point there needs, part of the expectation game here has to be, what do we realistically expect of our politicians? Because I think it's the cult of personality. It's a strong word, but it's one that I think is apropos to this topic. I drive by houses that still fly Trump flags, and it's May. I see, I drive by, cars on the highway flying Trump flags. It's May. And I think there's a relevant question to ask about how do we react to this change in kind of the civic fabric of the United States, where personality or sort of sharing someone's various sundry prejudices and bigotries is more important than policy. And maybe 'twas ever thus. Certainly I think that's an important reason, for instance, why Nixon won in '68 over Humphrey. But as millennials and then Gen Z coming up behind us, as we begin to make up more and more of the electorate, I think that's a question we really have to be honest with ourselves about, is what's our relationship with our leaders? Because I think in a lot of ways we've decided what our relationship with the church is like, and our church leaders. We hold them maybe a bit more at arm's length than our parents did and our grandparents did. But I think we're still answering that question for our political leaders. How much of sort of at an arm's length are we keeping them? And I think in response to sort of a presidency that relied partly on a cult of personality, I think it's a legitimate question to ask. I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, I know it was an unanswerable question to start with, so so it's probably a little bit too early for you to think about your next book or anything like that, right? I mean,
I have a toddler, so my next book is going to be on the theology of Paw Patrol.
There you go. Well, it's like there have been many authors who I work with that started with adult nonfiction and went on to do children's books. So there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. I toyed with the idea of pitching a book to my publisher on my experience of searching for a new pastorate during COVID. I sort of began searching a few months before COVID hit, and then was kind of stuck with that circumstance. And sort of just talking about how has COVID really forced a lot of us in churches to change, to try to get up to speed with new technology, because that didn't always happen on a regional or denominational level in Search and Call. So I think there was probably a book to be written there about that, but that experience of searching and then moving during a pandemic took so much out of me that I realized that wasn't the book I could write. Maybe someday I'll write some sort of reflection on, with the benefit of a bit more hindsight, on the impact of COVID on the church. But I think it'll look quite a bit different than what I originally imagined it. But I think there are a lot of stories to tell from this time in our history. Whenever the dust settles, there's going to be a lot of stories to tell.
Mm-hmm. No doubt. Well, Eric, thanks for spending some time with us, and thanks so much for putting together this book. It's really an important set of topics. I'm really glad to see your leadership in this direction.
Well, I really appreciate you extending me the invitation to have this conversation. Speaking of COVID, that's sort of, the book dropped during the pandemic. And so I sort of didn't get a chance to have a lot of these conversations. And so it means a lot to be able to kind of dive back into that. So thank you for making that.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I started doing this, because I know I had so many author friends that, weren't going to be able to do their book tours and book signings like they normally would. So hopefully this will help.
Yeah.
All right, Eric. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thanks so much.